Title: The Last Stand of Willow Creek. The first time I heard the sirens, I thought there had been an accident on the main road. But as I stepped outside onto my porch, coffee in hand, I saw two police cruisers parked right outside my barn. Officers stood by their vehicles, hands on their belts, their expressions wary, like they were about to break up a hostage situation. The so-called criminals? My chickens. That's when I knew my entitled neighbor, Eleanor Whitmore, had escalated things. It had started small, a few complaints here and there. A passive-aggressive letter slipped into my mailbox. An unexpected visit from the county inspector. At first, I thought it was all just coincidence, until I learned about Eleanor and the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Eleanor wasn't just a busybody with too much time on her hands. She was the self-proclaimed queen of Willow Creek, the kind of woman who could fine you for leaving your trash bin out 10 minutes too long. And somehow, in her mind, my small farm was an eyesore, a blight upon her pristine world. I had moved to Willow Creek for peace and quiet. I wanted open fields, the sound of my animals in the morning, and the satisfaction of building something of my own. Instead, I had found myself in the middle of a war. And this morning, that war had taken a turn for the ridiculous. One of the officers, a tall guy with a sharp jawline and tired eyes, approached me. "Sir, we received a complaint about an aggressive animal on the loose." I raised an eyebrow. Aggressive? He hesitated, glancing toward the pasture, where my donkey, Gus, stood lazily in the sun, swishing his tail. I crossed my arms. "You're telling me someone called 911 over Gus?" The second officer, a woman with a no-nonsense expression, sighed. The caller claimed the donkey was chasing people and causing a public disturbance. I gestured toward Gus, who at that very moment let out a loud, obnoxious yawn and flopped onto his side like an overgrown dog. The officers exchanged glances. The woman pursed her lips. "Yeah, that doesn't exactly scream public menace." I sighed. "Let me guess. Eleanor Whitmore?" Neither officer confirmed it, but the slight twitch in the man's jaw told me everything I needed to know. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my temples. "I have security footage. You'll see there was no rampaging donkey." They followed me inside, where I pulled up the surveillance from earlier that morning. And there, clear as day, was Eleanor standing at the edge of my property, her phone out, pointing at my animals as if trying to make them do something incriminating. Then came the best part, the moment she took out a bag of breadcrumbs and tried luring my chickens toward the fence as if that would prove they were running wild. The officers watched in silence before the woman finally let out a groan. "You've got to be kidding me." I smirked. "Oh, it gets better." I fast-forwarded to a clip from 2 days ago. Eleanor standing outside my fence, shouting at Gus, waving her arms dramatically, trying to rile him up. Gus, being the saint that he was, merely blinked at her, turned around, and promptly took a very large dump in her direction. The male officer covered his mouth, barely suppressing a laugh. The female officer sighed. "All right, this is textbook false reporting. We'll handle it." And with that, they left to have a word with Eleanor. I watched them go, wondering if this would finally be the end of it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The police officers had barely pulled out of my driveway before I knew, deep in my gut, that Eleanor wasn't finished. Sure, they had given her a warning. But warnings didn't mean anything to people like Eleanor Whitmore. If anything, they fueled the fire, making her more determined to get her way. And I was right. The next morning, I woke up to find something new, an official-looking letter taped to my front door. It had the Willow Creek HOA logo at the top, bold red letters stamped across it. Notice of violation. I groaned, ripping it off the door as I headed inside. Pouring myself a cup of coffee, I sat down at the kitchen table and scanned the nonsense Eleanor had cooked up this time. Unauthorized livestock. The presence of farm animals within the Willow Creek residential community violates HOA Policy 17B. Noise complaint. The sound of crowing, braying, and other disruptive noises has disturbed the peace of nearby residents. Odor infraction. Complaints have been filed regarding the strong smell of farm waste negatively affecting property values. At the bottom, in a looping, arrogant signature, Eleanor Whitmore, HOA president. I sighed. I didn't even live in the HOA. It had taken me all of 10 minutes when I first moved in to verify that my land was completely independent of their little kingdom of beige houses and manicured lawns. But that hadn't stopped Eleanor from trying to assert her authority over me time and time again. I crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash. She'd made one mistake, though. She had signed her name. That meant this wasn't just a petty complaint. This was a fraud. I wasn't the type to escalate things without cause, but Eleanor had crossed a line. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I called my lawyer, Danny Martinez. Danny was an old friend from college, one of those guys who lived for a legal fight. He was the kind of lawyer who actually enjoyed reading through zoning laws, which made him the perfect person to deal with this mess. When I explained the situation over the phone, he let out a low whistle. She really put it in writing? Oh yeah, I said. With her signature and everything. He laughed. That's incredibly stupid. That's Eleanor. Well, congratulations. You have a case for harassment, fraud, and possibly even libel. Send me a copy of that letter, and I'll draft a response. I scanned the letter and emailed it over. Less than an hour later, Danny had a document ready to go. It was a formal cease and desist notice, outlining the legal ramifications of her actions, including possible civil lawsuits and criminal charges if she continued. And the best part? It demanded a public, written apology. I printed it out, sealed it in an envelope, and drove straight to the HOA's pristine little headquarters, where I hand-delivered it to the receptionist. She barely glanced at it before setting it aside in a pile of paperwork. I'll make sure Ms. Whitmore gets this. I smiled. Oh, I hope so. Because Eleanor had been pushing her luck for far too long, and she was about to learn that I pushed back. 2 days after I delivered the cease and desist notice, I got my first taste of Eleanor's reaction. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a quiet retreat. It was war. I was out repairing the fence along the eastern side of my property when I noticed a familiar figure marching toward me. Eleanor, in all her righteous fury, wearing a pristine beige pantsuit and clutching a stack of papers like they were weapons. Behind her, 2 men in cheap suits trailed along, struggling to keep up. Danny had warned me she might try something dramatic, and yet, I still wasn't fully prepared for what came next. Eleanor stomped up to the fence, her face already red with anger. This is outrageous, she snapped, shaking the papers at me like a lunatic. You dare threaten me? I leaned against the post I had been fixing, wiping the sweat off my forehead with the back of my hand. Oh, you got the letter? Good. Saves me the trouble of explaining it. Her mouth opened and closed like a goldfish gasping for air. You think you can intimidate me with legal nonsense? It's not nonsense, I said calmly. It's the law. You forged HOA violation letters and tried to find someone who doesn't even live under your jurisdiction. One of the men behind her cleared his throat awkwardly. Ms. Whitmore, perhaps we should. Quiet, Martin, she snapped, before turning back to me. You must comply with the HOA's standards. You are lowering property values with this barnyard mess. I crossed my arms. Eleanor, let me put this in terms you'll understand. Your HOA rules don't apply to me. Never have. Never will. And if you keep harassing me, I will sue. Her nostrils flared. She turned to the other man behind her. Tell him he has to listen. The second man, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, let out a long sigh. Legally speaking, Ms. Whitmore, he's correct. His land is outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Eleanor turned ghostly pale. That's impossible. No, Eleanor, I said with a smirk. That's facts. She stood there for a moment, trembling with rage, before turning on her heel and storming off. But I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Later that evening, I got a call from Linda Hayes, one of the Willow Creek HOA board members. Unlike Eleanor, Linda was one of the reasonable ones, or at least as reasonable as someone in an HOA could be. Jack, she said, sighing into the phone, I don't normally get involved in Eleanor's nonsense, but what did you do to her? I laughed. Nothing. I just reminded her that she doesn't own my property. Well, Linda said, lowering her voice. She's losing it. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, ranted for 20 minutes straight about how you're destroying the community, and demanded that we find a way to take legal action against you. I snorted. And what did the board say? Linda hesitated. The thing is, a lot of people are getting sick of her. This isn't the first time she's dragged us into some personal vendetta, and frankly, some of us think she's putting the HOA at risk. We can't afford a lawsuit. So what's the plan? I asked. Linda exhaled. We're voting tomorrow to remove her as HOA president. I nearly dropped my phone. Well, that escalated quickly. The next day, I sat back on my porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the HOA clubhouse from a distance. Cars pulled into the parking lot one by one, carrying board members and neighborhood busybodies who had once blindly followed Eleanor's rule. By the time the meeting started, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Linda filled me in afterward. Eleanor had come in confident, arrogant, even believing she still had control over the HOA. But as the meeting unfolded, she quickly realized that she was alone. One by one, board members spoke out against her. She's reckless. She's put us in legal jeopardy. She's a liability. And then came the final blow. Linda stood up, cleared her throat, and read aloud a motion to remove Eleanor Whitmore as HOA president, effective immediately. The vote was held. It wasn't even close. By the end of the night, Eleanor was no longer in power. I was just finishing up feeding Gus when Linda stopped by later that evening. Well, she said, crossing her arms, it's over. I grinned. She's gone. Linda nodded. She stormed out after the vote, shouting about how she was going to sue everyone for defamation. But honestly, no one's scared of her anymore. I exhaled, letting the tension finally ease out of my shoulders. So, does this mean I can finally live in peace? Linda laughed. I think so. For what it's worth, most of us don't have a problem with your farm. And without Eleanor constantly stirring the pot, I think things are going to be a lot quieter around here. I glanced toward the now empty HOA clubhouse and smirked. Good. Because Eleanor had lost. And I had won. I should have known Eleanor wouldn't go quietly. The morning after her humiliating downfall, I woke up to something I hadn't seen in months. Absolute peace. No HOA letters. No bogus complaints. No unnecessary police visits. And then, at precisely noon, my phone rang. It was Danny. Well, he said, amusement laced in his voice, your favorite ex-HOA president just made a colossal mistake. I set down my coffee. What now? She filed a lawsuit. I blinked. Against me? Yep. She's claiming emotional distress, property depreciation, and, get this, public defamation. Says you personally orchestrated a campaign to ruin her reputation. I let out a low whistle. Wow. She really doesn't know when to quit. Oh, it gets better, Danny continued. She's representing herself. I laughed so hard that I nearly choked on my coffee. Of course, Eleanor thought she could outmaneuver an actual attorney with her self-righteous entitlement alone. Danny sighed dramatically. I'm filing for immediate dismissal. But if you want to have a little fun with it, we could countersue. I grinned. Oh, let's see how this plays out first. I had a feeling Eleanor's case wouldn't last long. A week later, I found myself sitting in a small-town courtroom, arms crossed as I watched Eleanor make an absolute fool of herself. She was dressed in a pristine cream-colored suit, her hair styled in tight, controlled waves, looking like she had walked straight out of a courtroom drama. But the moment she started speaking, the illusion crumbled. Your Honor, she said, voice quivering with indignation. This man has made my life a living nightmare. He has defied our community's standards, mocked me publicly, and personally led an online smear campaign against my name. Judge Lawson, a no-nonsense woman who had clearly seen her fair share of nonsense, adjusted her glasses. Do you have any evidence of this alleged smear campaign, Ms. Whitmore? Eleanor flipped through her stack of papers dramatically before holding up a printed-out meme. I nearly lost it. The meme in question? A photoshopped image of Eleanor in a medieval queen's outfit with the caption, All hail the tyrant of Willow Creek, ruler of beige and HOA fines. Danny leaned toward me, whispering, Whoever made that deserves a medal. The judge sighed. Ms. Whitmore, internet jokes do not constitute defamation. Eleanor sputtered. But the farm. It's ruining property values. Danny stood smoothly. Your Honor, my client's property is legally exempt from HOA regulations. Furthermore, I have zoning documents proving that his land values have actually increased in the past year. The judge skimmed the documents and then looked back at Eleanor. Ms. Whitmore, unless you have actual legal grounds for your claims, I am dismissing this case. Eleanor's face turned a lovely shade of beet red. But, dismissed. With a final bang of the gavel, it was over. Eleanor had lost again. I thought that would be the end of it. I hoped that would be the end of it. But Eleanor? Oh no, she had one last card to play. A week after her courtroom failure, I woke up to find my fence spray painted with the words, HOA wins. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Really? I checked the security cameras. Sure enough, there she was, Eleanor herself, skulking around my property in the dead of night with a can of red spray paint. I had her. Without hesitation, I called the sheriff. Within the hour, 2 officers knocked on Eleanor's door, arresting her for trespassing and vandalism. The entire neighborhood watched as she was let out in handcuffs, screeching about how she was the real victim. By the time the dust settled, Eleanor was facing real criminal charges, a restraining order, and worst of all, for her at least, social exile. No one wanted anything to do with her anymore. The woman who had once terrorized the neighborhood now found herself completely alone. With Eleanor out of the picture for good, life in Willow Creek finally settled down. The HOA, under new leadership, became far less aggressive. The constant fines and ridiculous rules eased up. My farm continued thriving, and for the first time in months, I could enjoy my land without looking over my shoulder. One afternoon, as I was finishing up repairs on my fence, Linda stopped by. "You know," she said, smirking, "I think you might have saved this town." I chuckled. I just wanted to be left alone. Well, either way, we all owe you. HOA life is a whole lot better without her running it. I glanced toward the empty house Eleanor had once occupied, now sitting vacant and abandoned. Good riddance. She nodded. Good riddance. As the sun set over my farm, Gus let out a triumphant bray, as if signaling the true end of an era. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. Months later, I heard a rumor. Eleanor had moved to another town, already trying to climb her way into their HOA. I laughed, shaking my head. Some people never learn. But me? I had everything I needed right here. My farm, my land, and most importantly, a life free of HOA tyranny. And that was all I had ever wanted.